The Banshee roams the countryside and can be heard wailing when she predicts a death. The word Banshee comes from the Irish Sea, pronounced Banshee, which translates as Woman of the Fairy Mounds. She can appear in a number of guises, as a young, beautiful woman, a stately matron, or as an ugly, frightening hag. She is usually dressed in a gray or white hooded cloak. While not always seen, her mourning cries can be heard usually at night when someone is about to die. Those who claim to have seen her describe long hair which she runs a comb through, similar to tearing the hair out in anguish. It is believed by many that she only appears to select number of families, namely the main Irish families: the O'Neills, O'Connors, O'Briens, O'Grady's, and Kavanaghs, although this list varies, depending on who is telling the story. Coincidentally, the Banshee will not harm the person she encounters. There is another Irish female spirit who isn't nearly as benign. The Lianhan Sede, pronounced Lanhan Shi, is a beautiful woman who attracts men, but this love will lead to their downfall. W. B. Yeats described her in his book Fairy and Folklore of the Irish Peasantry. The Lianhan Shi seeks the love of mortals. If they refuse, she must be their slave. If they consent, they are hers, and can only escape by finding another to take their place. The fairy lives on their life, and they waste away. Death is no escape from her. She is the Gaelic muse, for she gives inspiration to those she persecutes. The Gaelic poets die young, for she is restless and will not let them remain long on earth. This malignant phantom. Mythology is a complex and fascinating part of Irish culture that has always been of interest. Some of the fairy stories and legends are so complicated they're practically a historical dynasty. There are leprechauns, pukas, and fairies that make up countless children's stories, as well as a host of more sinister creatures. In every part of the country, there are different variations, omens, and tales, some more believable than others about each creature, particularly ways to keep them away or cause them to do harm to others, known as pisogues. Certain fairies were associated with powerful families throughout the country, and their appearances have made their way into Gaelic folklore. The Banshee is one of the more intimidating fairies. She is a fairy woman who appears at the sight of an imminent death in the middle of the night and lets out a chilling, high pitched wail. As with all mythological stories and figures, she also appears in Scottish, Welsh, Norse, and even American folklore in many different forms and doing many different death related things. Occasionally, she is also known as the Bien Chante, or crying woman. The origin of the Banshee is really quite ordinary compared to the tales that surround her. In medieval times, during funerals, a woman would take on the role of keener. Keeners sang sad songs called the Keone, the Irish word for crying, at the graveside. There was good business to be made as a keener, as families would pay very well for a talented one. The best known ones always attended the funerals of the biggest and most well known people and were much sought after. As the more people mourning at a funeral, the greater the person was said to be. For the most powerful families, it was a common belief that a being Sede, a fairy woman, would come to keen at the grave. Fairies, presumably being more talented singers than any human. The Irish phrase became angelicized to Banshee, and over time the stories developed and morphed into what we know today. The fact that the keeners were paid in alcohol and often ended up as elderly alcoholic women that were banished from towns and villages also adds to the myth. The first known written record of a Banshee story is Sean McCraith's Catherine Thorin Delbig, or Triumphs of Turlough. Originally, the Banshee appeared to people who were about to suffer a violent and painful death, such as murder. In later stories, she wailed outside their door at night, usually around wooded areas close by, but was rarely seen. Cynics and realists who claim the story to be nothing more than an old wives' tale say that the wails are actually just barn owls or vixens calling in the night. If you've ever heard either animal, they do sound remarkably similar to a woman screeching. The banshee was usually described as ugly elderly women dressed in white or gray with long silver hair, and occasionally took the form of a crow, stoat, hare, or weasel, typical animals associated with witchcraft in Ireland. The banshee comes in three possible guises depending on who you talk to or where the stories come from. More often than not, she is a crouching hag with a horrible wrinkly face, although in other stories she is a beautiful, ethereal young woman or a stately matron type. In yet more stories, she is referred to as the ghost of a murdered woman or a woman who died in childbirth. The three typical guises of the banshee may represent the three aspects of the Celtic goddess of war and death: Barbe, Macha, and Morriogane. In almost all cases, the banshee has long silver hair that she is sometimes seen brushing with a comb. For this reason, some people would never pick up a comb lying on the ground for fear of being taken away by fairies. She wears a gray hooded cloak with a white sheet grave robe of the dead, and her eyes are red from crying. Many believe that she can, in fact, take on any of the above forms and change from one to the other as she pleases. Her cry seems to be the subject of much debate. In Leinster, it is said to be so shrill that it shatters glass. Further north in Tyrone, she sounds more like two boards being struck together, while in Kerry her call is low, pleasant singing. Whatever the sound's like, everyone agrees that she can be heard from a great distance. Some report hearing her cry for several nights in a row before her death occurred, while others say they heard her just once on the night of the death. Her cry rises and falls and lasts for at least a few minutes, varying in intensity. There have been alleged incidents when the banshee cried for a person who was in perfect health, but was found dead within a week from some freak accident. The majority of her visits are paid at night, with a small few taking place at noon. The banshee was usually thought to have once been a normal woman who enjoyed life, was incredibly beautiful and radiated happiness, but some great sorrow overcame her at some point in her life, and she became a haggard old woman. She was seemingly very wary of mortals and would disappear at the first sign of any human activity. In fact, she didn't seem to enjoy the company of anyone, mortal or not, and traveled as a solitary fairy. When the banshee moved from place to place, witnesses have heard a fluttering sound similar to birds crying. When she disappeared, all that would be left behind was a cloud of mist. There are several purported banshee chairs around Ireland, wedge-shaped rocks where she would sit and cry for general misfortunes. If there was no death to be attended to, that is. When a family immigrated, legend has it, the banshee would follow. Or if she didn't, she would stay at the family seat and lament their leaving there. The banshee was relatively harmless, apart from the dread people felt at hearing her cry. The only other fearsome activities she seemed to get up to were knocking on doors or windows. However, there was a legend that her sister spirit, the Leanne Sede, or Sweetheart Fairy, was somewhat more malicious. She sought the love of mortal men, and their desire for her was so intense that they were driven to madness and ultimately destroyed. There was also a similar manifestation of the banshee known as the Bingnigay, or washing woman, although this is more attributed to Scottish folklore than Irish. Instead of wailing and crying at night to warn someone of a death, she would instead wash the bloody clothes of the person about to meet their doom in a local water source. Her appearance was generally thought to be the same, although she was sometimes washing her own bloody clothes instead of someone else's. What's going on, everybody? So yeah, you guys have it, the Banshee. This is, I know it's mostly like an Irish thing, Scottish, like they were saying, Norse, stuff like that. But I remember hearing a story of the Banshee um, when Hurricane Katrina happened. Um, I don't quite remember where I heard the story. I want to say that the story came from Dark Waters at the time. That people in Louisiana at the time, in New Orleans, heard the screams of the Banshee. Um, I have to go back and listen to that. Maybe like reach out to him and speak to him and see if that did come from him. I would really like for him to tell that story again if he had any other information about it besides when he put it out the first time. Um, but yeah, it's pretty creepy, man. The Banshee is uh, just the fact that you can hear it, or it's a kind of like a warning to someone's death. That's creepy in itself. Um, just hearing it and just knowing that someone's gonna die. I didn't make any mention if people heard it were the ones to actually die, or if people hearing it would know that someone else was gonna die. So that's probably a distinction that I probably want to get to the bottom of. I probably will. So, if you guys have any information on the Banshee, you guys have any stories, if you know anything about that, um, that would be pretty interesting. Um, there's a famous story about the Banshee here that I want to dive into real quick. Um, let's see, the Banshee also liked to cry at the crowning of a true king. One reported case of this happening was at the crowning of legendary Brian Boru, who overthrew the O'Neills and began the O'Brien dynasty. Possibly the only example of a human Banshee appearance was in 1437, when a woman purporting to be a seer approached King James I of Scotland and correctly predicted his murder at the instigation of the Earl of Atholl. In 1801, the Banshee paid a visit to the commander-in-chief of the British forces in Ireland. He had attended a party at Dublin Castle and invited a few guests back to his home in Mount Kennedy, Wicklow, afterwards. These guests, Sir Jonah Barrington and his wife, woke up at 2:30 a.m. to what he described as a plaintive sounds coming from outside his window. His wife and a maid were also awoken by it, and the sound later turned into the name Rossmore, being screeched 3 times. The next morning, they were told that a servant, having heard odd sounds from Rossmore's room at 2:30 a.m., entered to find him dying. Spooky. Yeah, so that's pretty crazy. But yeah, guys, I really hope you like that. That's definitely interesting. If you guys have any other stories about it, put them down in the comments. Let me know. Send me an email. Something. Um, it's super, super interesting. Extremely creepy as well. So if you guys hear anything like that, man, you better say your prayers. Some crazy shit's about to happen right afterwards. But yeah, guys, appreciate you stopping in. All the social media will be down below as well. We're locals.com as well. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio. Be watching out for new episodes of the Truth Defender podcast. You guys stay safe out there, stay blessed, and most of all, stay frosty.